All right, everyone. Welcome to today's discussion on Dryland. Before we get started, I'm going to keep everyone's video off and audio off during the presentation. This just helps with the quality of shifting through the slides and everything via Zoom. But what I want you to do is I want you to open the chat. So there's a chat feature as part of Zoom. I dropped some questions in there that are going to pop up during this presentation. And I want you to go into the chat, look at those questions, get a sheet of paper out, whatever you need to do, or if you have your phone, you can type out a note on your phone. And you need to look at those questions because then at the end of this class, we're going to turn on the video, turn on the audio, and talk a little bit about that. So this will be a little bit shorter of a discussion today compared to the last one. I know that last one was pretty lengthy and had a lot of information on the science behind Dryland. This one's going to definitely have more of the art component of Dryland and just what I've seen over the years of training athletes with respect to the science. So remember, open the chat. I want you to actually, look at those questions in the chat and, really think about them from a season review. So those questions are geared toward last season, and we're going to, get live at the end. So make sure you stay on at the end of this session. So once I'm done talking, I'll make sure we turn on all the live videos, get to say hello, catch up, and really dive into those questions because those are super helpful for me as we, go into this new season and everything like that. So today's talk, like I said, is on, how much Dryland is enough? Because I know that's a question that pops up. As an athlete, you're always asking, did I do enough to achieve my goals? So, it's a tough question to answer at times. It's tough to really figure out if you did enough, could you have done more? I think from an athlete standpoint, we always think that we could do more. So remember, open up the chat, look at those questions I posted. And then at the end of this, again, we are going to turn on the live video and everything like that. So make sure you hang out and that way we can talk at the end and go through those. So if you're just waking up, depending on where you are in the world, or you're getting ready for bed, here's your warning that we will be turning on the video at the end. So be prepared for that. So let's get into the talk today. So before we go deep diving into all of this, like I said, it's going to be a lot more about the art of coaching from my perspective, or the art of being an athlete, because there's definitely this balance of science and art to this whole process. It's not, we don't live in a lab, right? So a lot of the research that's conducted is conducted in a very sterile environment. And what I mean by that is just like everything's controlled. Well, in sport and life, as we know at this point, with everything going on with COVID-19, we don't have a control of a whole lot. So, it's tough to take science and apply it directly to life, but it's also a good measure for us to have a baseline. So before we go any further, I just want you to know, I'm going to be completely honest, the perfect plan does not exist. And the reason for that is not necessarily from writing the plan's perspective, but you have things like travel that pop up. You have things like illness, or in our current state, a pandemic pops up. You have response levels to stress. Like, how do you handle stress versus one of your teammates? How do your coaches handle stress compared to your athletes? That sort of thing. And then nutrition. We don't all eat the same. We don't all like the same things. We're all different dedication levels to nutrition. So that's something that, is always going to affect your plan. And then this is not a shot at any athletes or anything like that, but let's be honest, athletes rarely execute everything as scheduled. So that could be a practice in the water. Maybe you didn't quite hit the intervals you're supposed to hit. And that could have been because of shoulder tension, lack of sleep, a busy day at school, and you're just kind of not mentally engaged. And, maybe you're just mentally tired and you just kind of need a breather. From a Dryland perspective, can you always push a little bit harder? Are there days you have to push back a little bit and kind of just go into that holding pattern? So there's, all these changes that happen. So even if you could write this perfect program, you could write this, phenomenal thing, there's all these other factors. So the best program is the one that you can adapt to fit your needs and still have progress. So keep that in mind. And kind of my measure, just so you can think about this, especially as you head into year 2 at your time here at the school, anything about 80% execution, you have a high chance of improvement. So that's pretty cool when you think of it from a school perspective. Like, I'm not even asking you to get an A. All you got to do is get a B, right? And a low B based on, I guess it depends on, your scoring system, but generally that 80% I look as like a B, almost like a B minus, right? And so I'm not even asking you to, achieve an A and A plus in terms of execution, but if you can be in that B to B minus range, you have a high chance of improvement. And then anything above 90%, so now we're getting into that A range, you're nearly guaranteed improvement in your performance in some capacity. So it's not even asking for perfect. And so that's the reason, a perfect plan isn't necessary. It's something that's always going to be evolving. I sent this out, a few weeks ago just to get you thinking a little bit. And basically this charts out if you aim to be 1% better every day. So instead of aiming to be, 20%, 30%, trying to have these massive jumps, if you aim to be 1% better every day, or if you allow yourself to be 1% worse every day, so you're just a little bit worse than that previous day, you can see this difference in progress. So, just a 1%, striving to be a 1% better every day results in about a 38% improvement over the course of the year. And what I did is when I posted this, I posed that question: what does a 38% improvement mean for you? And is that the difference between making it back for finals or not? And is that the difference between an A final or a B final? And for all the second place finishes we had at nationals this past year, 38% was probably the difference between winning and taking second, right? Easily, that could have made a huge difference. So think about your training from this perspective of small or tiny gains, as this, this piece says here, instead of trying to make these massive jumps, because that tiny gain approach is going to be more sustainable throughout your training. All right. And as we get into this, you have to know your body. That's really the only way you're going to figure out how much dryland is enough for you. And it takes you as an athlete investing in this process. So I can write one thing, I can give you the resources, coach can give you the resources for what you're doing in the water. But if you're not taking this reflective approach on your own body, then you're never going to truly know what's the best path for you. So again, I posted those questions in the chat here on Zoom. Make sure you're thinking about these questions throughout the course of this talk, so that way when we get to the end, we can actually dive into these a little bit more based off of your individual needs. Okay, so instead of going through all these crazy measures, I just boiled it down to 3 things I want you to think about in terms of knowing your body. So the first one is resting heart rate and respiratory rate, and we'll talk about that one, hydration levels, and past performances. The reason I picked these things, number one, a lot of good research, on these topics, and it's something that, we can really focus on and implement without that much of an issue moving forward. And I saw, I think it was AV posted that she could not see the questions in the chat. So what I'll do real quick before we go any further, just going to read these questions real quick. And this is based off of your training from last year and how you were preparing. So where did you feel prepared with your dryland training last year? Where did you feel underprepared with your dryland training for last year? What worked for you last year? What did you feel like was a valuable piece for you? And what did not fit your training style last year? And these are all from a dryland perspective. And I'll post those questions again so you can see them. But getting back to this, knowing your body. Again, if you don't know your body, you're not going to know what you need. Okay. It doesn't matter what a coach tells you. It doesn't matter, what is programmed. If you don't know how you're responding to it, it's not going to help. You don't have any data to go off of. So this is where you have to step up as an athlete and take ownership of your process. So why is this important? And this is one of my favorite slides. A few years ago, I helped with a summit where I got to interview a bunch of different coaches and practitioners. And this is a physical therapist from Austin, Texas that I got to know really well during my time there and got to work with. And why is it important to know your body? And this sums it up perfectly. Okay. Injury or illness sustained in 6 months preceding a competition results in a substantially reduced likelihood of achieving your performance goals. Okay, so we see injury and illness are very much a negative to the process, right? And swimming happens in a tough time of year with weather changes, and you're getting out of a cold pool, and into a cold environment, for example, and you have to manage all these things and you got the stress of school, right? So we have to kind of focus on this whole process. Here's the next stat that's really interesting. For every modified training week, based off of that goal, there's a 25% decreased likelihood of success. So that means anytime we have to tweak something, and I don't want to use the word negatively, but let's say we have to back off or scale a little bit or go a different direction based off of where we think you should be in the year, there's a drop in that likelihood of success. But then here's the great news, and this is what we talked about at the beginning. Athletes who complete more than 80% of their planned training, so whatever was scheduled or whatever was planned, were 7 times more likely to achieve their season goal. I don't know about you, but I'll take 7 times any way I can get it from an athletic performance perspective. And if you're telling me just by completing a B-level effort or a B-level workload of training gets me to that 7 times, man, that's something I feel like I can actually do, right? It's not just something that seems like a pie in the sky goal. You know, if you look at your training and you look at your process, I want you to look in the mirror and actually ask yourself, can you give 80%? Can you achieve 80% of that process? So that doesn't mean giving 80% every day. It means achieving 80% of that overall process throughout the course of the season. And I think you can all do it, right? That's something that's definitely attainable. Going into breathing. So this is getting to know your body and figuring out how much dry land is enough for you. Resting heart rate or resting respiratory rate are 2 really good measures, and they're pretty easy to utilize, especially resting heart rate. So if you have a Fitbit, if you have a Garmin watch, anything like that, a lot of things track your resting heart rate for you. It's also something you can do right when you wake up in the morning. You know, take your pulse, you know, track it based off of time and figure out your resting heart rate from there. Resting respiratory rate is a little bit harder, but that's how many breaths you take in a minute. And we want to know what that is at rest. In terms of gold standard, I would say that resting respiratory rate is definitely a little bit higher rated than heart rate, but they both provide really good data and are pretty easy to do overall. So again, resting heart rate goal is to take it honestly right when you first wake up to get a true measure of what your resting heart rate is like. And like I said, there's wearables, or you can honestly just do it, you know, hands-on, you know, your point of contact for testing that pulse rate, and then using a clock, right? Take one of these measures daily. So this is where, you know, it takes you investing in this process, and you need to figure out an average. So I take a 7-day average is what I like to do. And then I figure out what my average heart rate is. And that's kind of my baseline number to go off of things. And then we need to understand variations in these numbers. And what I mean by variation is honestly 2 beats per minute difference or 2 breaths per minute difference for 2 or more days. So that's variation to me. Obviously, if it drops in breaths per minute or beats per minute, that might be a positive training response, which is great. But if it's starting to rise compared to what we're used to, that means we're probably training a little bit too hard, or we're not recovering as much as we could. And I'll explain that a little bit more here. So an elevated heart rate or elevated respiratory rate, so how many breaths you're taking a minute, number 1 means you could not be fully recovering. Number 2, you could be experiencing some sort of infection. Number 3, you could be about to get sick, or you are sick at this point. And number 4, maybe you're not giving your body enough nutrient to do what it needs to do. All 4 of those things are not helpful to the athletic performance process and should be monitored, right? We can kind of agree all of these things are not, it's not a great idea to go into nationals with an illness or an infection or lack of nutrition or not feeling fully recovered. I think we can agree that all these things carry some of that negative weight and are worth monitoring and making sure they don't go too far down a rabbit hole if we can control them. So this is pretty cool. This takes, if you ever heard of Whoop, Whoop is a monitoring device that you can get. I'm not a paid endorser of Whoop or anything like that, but I like a lot of the research they're doing. So this is looking at breathing rate, and you can see there's not a whole lot of change in breathing rate here from, you know, February 29th all the way to March 10th. And then all of a sudden you see this little spike that happens. And this is just really interesting because we go back to some of these previous points. Okay, what could be happening here? You know, they could be not fully recovered. Maybe they're experiencing some sort of infection or illness, or maybe there's a lack of nutrition. This is very telling to the time because that person ended up having COVID-19 symptoms and everything started to show right on March 11th. If you look at their breathing rate, the respiratory rate at rest, it pinpointed exactly when those symptoms came on. So I know that's really interesting. I mean, the nerd in me kind of geeks out on this type of stuff, but all of a sudden we can see when the onset of illness and things like that are going to happen based off of this rate. So one thing I do when I track my resting heart rate, if I go 2 or 3 days with an elevated heart rate and I look at my training and maybe my training's having an effect, I can almost pinpoint when I might start to get sick, and then I can get ahead of that. So it's not as, I can't stop myself from getting sick. Maybe it's already kind of in queue. I've already pushed too hard, all these type of things. But if I see the change in my heart rate, I can at least blunt the effects of that, right? I can, to use a term we're using today, I can flatten that curve and make sure that it's not as acute, it's not as a long duration, based off of just a simple thing of breathing rate and heart rate. And that's something that's proved very true to me over the years, and it's something I definitely stand by from a training perspective. Moving on to hydration. Honestly, if you're not doing some sort of tracking for hydration, you're just not really that invested in your recovery. Hydration is a major part of your process, and until you take hydration seriously, you're missing out on performance, and you're missing out on even truly understanding what your body can handle. The reasoning for that, honestly, and when I talk about hydration, I'm looking at strictly water intake. I'm not looking at sports drinks. I'm not looking at protein shakes, anything like that. I look at strictly water intake because I want to know exactly how much pure water you're getting into your system, because I put that high of a value on that ingredient to your process. As little as 2% dehydration results in impaired function. I believe once you get to about 3 or 4%, it's about the same as drunk driving, which 2 to 4% is not a whole lot of body weight. It's not a whole lot of drop in hydration. So if 2% makes an impaired function, imagine what 2% does to your performance. Imagine if you're dehydrated heading into finals, for your major meet, and you're not prepared to perform. You're already digging yourself a hole before you get up on the blocks. And I like to start with a base of water because I think that's such a critical component to this, and then add specific drinks, electrolytes, protein shakes, whatever, to your process based off of your needs. And if you got any other formulas from Coach Andrew, I'd totally stick with those formulas, but this is one that I use just personally. So I take my ounces of water that I'm supposed to drink in a day. I take my body weight in pounds, times it by 0.5, and then I add 10 for the strenuous exercise effect. So generally, especially with like a swimming population, you guys participate in a very strenuous exercise. So a general day-to-day lifestyle person might do body weight in pounds times 0.5, and that be their ounces that they aim for in a day. But from that intense aspect of swimming, we add the 10 ounces of water to help combat the effects of that, intense activity. And the easiest way that I found to track this is I have a water bottle that literally has it ticked out on the side in terms of ounces, and I know how many I have to drink in a day. So I have to drink about 4 of that water bottle to hit my goal for the day. And so I try to space those out, have one in the morning, have one about mid-morning, early afternoon, and then evening. And then anything else on top of that's gravy. So that's something you should really focus on to learn and see how much you can actually push yourself and recover. And then these are the questions I posed earlier today that you're supposed to be thinking about. And again, remember, we're going to kick up the video here at the end and audio, and we'll get to talk and really break down these questions a little bit further based off of your individual performances. But you have to take inventory of your training. You have to take inventory of what's going on and what has happened in the past. So, do you even know what type of success you've had in the past based off your training? Do you know what led to that success as part of your training? Did you have a failure moment where you thought something was going to work and it didn't? And you have to take all these things into account, because this is how we figure out how much Dryland is effective for you. And also, when do we need to pull you back off of different volumes and intensities to have you prepared for your training process. So this is where, if you ever hear of athletes journaling about their training and really being detailed in this process, this is why, because then you start to minimize the risk of, what they call a failed taper or missing a taper, right? Because we have all this historical data of what worked and didn't work, and we can fine tune it over time. And part of this process is a season review where you say, hey, I really felt prepared with my kick this year. I didn't feel as prepared with my lung capacity, for example. What worked for me last season, I liked, the length of the sessions, but I also didn't like that there weren't more sessions to do. All of those things are this whole process, and that's stuff that we can mine and figure out. And it takes objective measures and subjective measures. So if you set a PR last year, something worked, right? It's something helped out, but maybe we could made it even a bigger PR. Where do we miss the boat on that? And then subjective is, I didn't really feel that great, or I didn't really feel at my top, even though I did set a PR. And although we talked about last time, you don't have to feel great to swim great, it's still something that, we have to take into account because there is a mental component there to performance. Now we're going to get into the actual phases of the season and how much dryland is enough for these phases. And again, this is going to take all that science we talked about last time and apply it to the art and kind of the historical knowledge I have as a coach. So you're going to see a lot of ranges, okay? You're not going to see an exact number, exact amount of time, and things like that. But these are the ranges that I've seen successful, and I'm going to explain why those ranges have worked. And then our goal is to figure out your individual needs from there. So during the off season or the preseason, these are kind of two combined stages in my mind. We want to attack any sort of weaknesses. So where did you not feel strong last year? Where did you struggle with injury last year? And then we want to build some strength because it's a great time. There's not as much overall volume with your training at this point in the year, especially right now with everything going on. So we can focus a little bit more effort on that strength building. And we'll do that with things like tempo and controlled pacing and all that type of stuff. Your volume is usually going to be a little bit higher on land just to give your body a break from swimming. So I know swimming has very short off seasons, especially if you're participating in a long course season and then a short course season. But we want to take those little breaks away from the pool just so we can come back fresh and ready to go. From a dryland side, honestly, 4 to 6 sessions a week is going to really help you, achieve that off-season training base that we're looking to achieve. If you're a visual person like me, this is what it's going to look like from a volume standpoint. So this top curve is going to be the dryland thing. So you're coming out of, your active rest here at the beginning. We're going to build up that training volume from, that point on. And then as we get closer to the season, we'll start to drift back down a little bit. From the swimming side, you're just kind of having a steady increase in volume, usually from the point where you come out of your active rest to where you're kicking it into season gear. But that volume is much lower than what it would look like, in season in the training. It's more of that maintenance volume. Maybe you're working on some form, breaking things back down to build back up type of deal. But we're kind of controlling that, and the dryland volume will be a little bit more at that point. What this looks like, these are all pictures that will be taken out of your training from the past year to kind of break it down a little bit more. Okay, so again, we talked about working on weaknesses. Often in swimming, the knee becomes really mobile when it's supposed to be really stable. The hip's supposed to be mobile, and often the hip becomes locked up and really stable when it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be switched. So we'll work on things like knee stability with a single leg squat where we're having some sort of tempo associated with it. And then, in the video, you guys probably get sick of hearing me saying, minimize any shake of your knee, minimize any side to side movement of your knee. There's a reason for that. We're trying to get that knee back to a stability point and get the mobility back to your ankles and your hips. So we use that off season to really focus on these sort of weaknesses, build that strength that is needed to have a stability component. And we're looking about 4 to 6 sessions a week. And the reason for that is just that nice steady base, and also to keep you moving and keep you mobile and things like that. Moving on into the early season, at this point, strength volume is going to have a slight decline before stabilizing. And the reason for that is all of a sudden swim volume goes up and everything can't keep going up, right? We can't keep just throwing stuff in. It's not like throwing the kitchen sink into it as well. We have to have this ebb and flow where strength, the dryland side, and swimming work together. If we just keep pushing up, and up, all of a sudden, that's where things start to break down. So from this point, we drop from 4 to 6 to about 3 to 5 sessions a week. And then, obviously the swim volume rises. And I can't stress this enough, but this is where you have to do your little mobility routines almost every day. I know, kind of hearing about Josh's process, for example, Josh strives to do some sort of mobility routine every day. And that's a phenomenal thing to get in the habit of. It doesn't have to be long. It could be 10, 15 minutes tops, but that's going to make the difference of all these little kinks that you're used to experiencing going away and just making sure you're ready to go. And if you plan it at the end of your day, it's a great way to kind of down regulate and get yourself ready for bed. So I save my mobility routines for the evening, and it just helps me relax, get taken care of, so that way I can go and fall asleep in no time. So, and kind of talking about these sessions a little bit, not every session has to be an hour long, hour and a half, heavy weight session. Think about it as quality movement this many times a week outside of the pool. All right. So same thing from that 4 to 6 that we saw in the preseason / off season. Yes, some of those could be heavy strength. Some of those could be just really targeted mobility work to make sure you're ready to go. So more of the session is just how many days you're dedicating to some sort of movement process throughout the course of this phase of the season. And honestly, that mobility phase, like going back to Josh as an example, daily mobility is fantastic, especially in the swimming world. And that's not going to amount in enough volume of any sort that it's negative. It's going to do more help than harm. So something to keep in mind. Now, again, if you're visual, so this top curve here that turns out to be the bottom curve at the starting point is your dryland. So you can see dryland goes down to accommodate swim volume going up. And that's why we have to kind of work together in this process, because if both of these things continuously go up at the beginning of the season, you're going to have a bunch of injuries and things like that pop up. Now, let's look at your example, right? If you have not trained all summer and then you come in and kick off dryland and swimming without really training all summer, you are kind of setting yourself up for a chance at injury. That's why the off season is so important for you to take control of your process and make sure you're prepared to come back to campus and ready to roll. Because although I'm planning this drop in volume and obviously coach has you swimming more because you're back on campus, it could seem like an increase in volume for you based off of what you took the time to do with your off season. Off season is definitely a time to recover. It's definitely a time to refocus and everything like that, but it's not a time to completely stop moving. So keep that in mind, because then this graph won't really look like this for you. It'll be a little bit different and you'll have a little bit different result and might have some aches and some tension that builds up, because of that process. So what does this look like? Example from a dryland side that you guys have done. Honestly, we're working on, we had 5 sets earlier on. I didn't know if you noticed that from the assisted single leg squat. It was 5 sets, but now we have 4 sets, and we count this one as just kind of a warm-up bar work set here. So a little bit decrease in volume in terms of how many sets you're doing. Still having a stimulus of weight come into the picture. We're working on different transitions. So I like to work on transitions in the early season because we're laying the foundation for faster transition work later. So what I mean by a transition, during the deadlift, a light touch to the floor and back up means you're learning how to control and break your body, so slow down, and then how to push back up effectively without kind of losing that control and slamming the weights into the ground. While that might just look like a deadlift with a barbell example, if you go hard into the wall on a flip turn and you can't control and make that change of direction smooth and in an efficient manner, that's when you get stuck on the wall. So we start with this kind of slower transition process, and then we build into faster and faster transitions over the course of the season. So we're just working on kind of that muscle memory component for now, and then we'll build from there. Then we head into winter training. For you guys, winter training is a little bit different because you guys go home, you have a little bit of pause in training, but I like to talk about this from a dryland perspective and from a swim perspective because it might be a little bit different than what you're used to. I'm used to hearing about what they call hell weeks and things like that, where you just know you're going to get obliterated from a swimming perspective. But all I want to urge you to do, whether or not that's a belief of yours, that's totally yours to figure out. But beware of bad habits during this time. One thing I often see from a winter training perspective is just people let their form completely break down, and then they add in 6,000 or 7,000 yards on top of that. So if we're trying to teach higher quality form, because higher quality form means you're a better mover means you're going to perform at a higher level, then are we really helping that process with the winter training kind of, hell week? And for example, I talked about this last time with the Keenan Robinson quote about swimming freestyle to get better at freestyle. He also had a really good quote in his talk that he said, someone asked, how much conditioning should I be doing outside of my 2-hour practice? And Keenan said, if you can't get in shape and conditioned in a 2-hour practice, I can't help you. And that's because there's this point of diminishing return. There's a point where it honestly is not worth it to add more volume on. And if you can't get in shape with the volume you have, that's something you got to look at how you can push harder in that time, because adding more volume is not always the answer. So be smart with your volume. And this picture here, this is one of my favorite examples. So when I was living in Austin, I had the chance to work with the Japanese national team. So that's some of their guys here. They were in Austin I think they were in the Arena Pro that year, and they needed a place to train while they were in town. So they came over and used the facility that I was working at. And I got to be on deck with them, kind of help their coaches. We did lactate testing, all different stuff right on deck, which was really, really cool. And I talked to the coaches, and the coach was like, yeah, we're in our winter training right now. This is our peak of training. I was like, awesome. Let's see what this looks like. I'm really curious here. Well, they did a little bit more than 4,000 yards and got out of the pool. And I was like, well, I thought you said this is like your winter training, thinking it from the American mindset of just pound people into the ground. And he goes, yeah, that was the most intense training we've done all year. And they took 4,000 yards and did lactate testing, everything, making sure they're truly in the right zones of training. But he said, yeah, we don't go over 4,500. And this was their middle distance crew that was training. So, think of your 200, 500 range guys and girls that were there for this event. And so that was super eye-opening to me, because how many of us from even a distance perspective think we need more than, 4,000 yards to get in shape? And don't get me wrong, these guys and girls were crawling out of the pool when they were done. They had so much data, and everything was very tactical in this approach. There was not a wasted yard the whole time, but it's such a shift compared to what I was used to hearing from a winter training. And that year they went and crushed at the Arena Pro at their peak of training. They won a lot of different events, and unfortunately, the Olympics aren't happening this year, but I think you'll see quite a change in Japan's performance as a country in the sport of swimming when we get to the next Olympics, or whenever we get to have the next games. Finally, as we get into late season and then championship season, you guys probably remember this from about January. There was a slight spike in dryland volume before we started a gradual decrease. We still were right around that 3 to 5 sessions a week. And then there's also a little bit more power movement starting to come in. So a lot more jump work, a lot more, hey, I want you to move quickly. I want you to complete 1 rep a second, that sort of stuff coming into the picture. What that looks like, from the graph standpoint, so your swimming volume, maybe you hit your peak of season and then you're starting to come back down. So that's this top curve. Dry land, still less than the swimming volume. Slight little spike here before we start dropping down the rest of the way. Volume does not mean intensity goes away. And I'll explain that a little bit more when we get to the championship point. But think of volume as, we're not doing 20 reps anymore. We're not doing high repetition. It's a little bit more to that 8, 6, 4 type of range, maybe even down to 2, and a lot more power movements. So I'm going to use one example here from the actual spike portion. So the spike here, I know I said, as we get down to that late season, we're out of the 20s, but this is that spike. So right when we hit that peak and then coming back down, we did deficit reverse lunges. We did 10 on each side. So that's kind of your peak in volume there. And then a quick drop down. And as we mentioned, the seated squat jump, we're working on a lot more power type movements coming into the picture. From this point on, you're not really seeing 20s anymore. It's kind of dropping down at that point. That volume starts to decrease. And we just do that little blip to honestly get that last little bit of stimulus to head into your championship taper with. And the reason I like that is it just gets you that last little push of volume for that strength component to give you a little kick in strength development before we drop things back off into the championship season. So at this point, volume is decreasing, but intensity is maintained. So what I mean by that, we're still working at 80, 90% ranges, but we're not doing as much of it. That could drop to 2 to 5 sessions a week. Each session in that, training is definitely, it takes less time. You start noticing you're done a little bit earlier in your intervals and things of that nature. So you start to have a little bit more free time to go about your day. From a visual standpoint, this top number is still, the top line is still the swimming volume. You're starting to see that nice steady trend. And again, this is kind of in a perfect world. It's not always going to look like this. If we kind of zoomed in on these lines, it'd be kind of zigzaggy, right? If we zoomed in and really just looked at a section, you might not see this overall trend of dropping down. So keep that in mind. It's not just a perfectly straight or perfectly curved line. If we actually zoomed in on a segment, it would still have some zigzags, some ebb and flow. The bottom line, that's looking at your dryland volume. And again, that's kind of just a visual of what you're looking at this point in the season. As we get to that championship point, a lot of speed, a lot of power, a lot of quickness starts to come in. And that's to get your mind and musculature communicating at the highest possible level. And the reason we keep that strength at a lot higher of a level than you probably would be used to or maybe accustomed to is because, honestly, I've learned from mistakes. And one example I have of this is I worked with a club program and we headed into sectionals, and honestly, the swim coaches were just a little bit weary about continuing to squat and deadlift and things like that. So we cut the training, we cut all the barbell or dumbbell type movements out of the training about 4 weeks before the meet. And what happened, although the kids still performed great, every kid came out of the water and was like, man, I just don't feel like I have my kick. I don't feel like I have that last little bit of power output to finish the race. And they were still, again, setting personal bests and things of that nature, but they still didn't feel right. Something felt off. And even the coaches noticed. They're like, yeah, they don't close as well as they used to. And what we realized was, it was that mind to muscle communication. There was that drop off in that kind of peak strength number, which the best way to describe it is kind of like an engine. If you, only have an engine that can produce a certain amount of horsepower, you're going to have a steady drop off in that horsepower over the course of a race. So strength allows you to have a little bit more horsepower to start, probably about the same amount of drop off over the course of a race. So your endpoint is still higher than it would be without that strength. So it's something, if we allow that strength to start to diminish too fast, it just kind of shows itself with your closing speed and everything like that. So that's why, yes, we have that speed, that power component involved, but we also keep some strength in there as well. So now we're getting to the end of this. I'm going to get ready to cue on the live video. So just a quick warning on that. But I have a question for you before we get there. And I'm going to ask this question now, but then I'll ask it again when we're actually, on the live segment. How many of you averaged 3 dryland sessions a week this season? And if I had to guess based off of the numbers I could pull up, remember I get to see every session you logged, I would say not many, right? And based off of each segment we talked about, this, from off season to early season to late season to championship season, you could see the number 3 was always in there somewhere. So if you're looking at an average amount of sessions based off of the research I've seen and practical side, 3 sessions a week is a good number to start with, and then see where you can build from there based off of, remember, how your resting heart rate responds. Are you training too hard? Are you taking care of that hydration component? And do you honestly need more than 3 sessions based off of your past performance? So again, if we look at that first talk that I gave, Swimming's high volume, right? It causes a lot of injury, even if you're really good at it and take care of yourself. So is adding more dry land necessarily the right thing to do when there's already enough volume there to cause injury, right? So we kind of have to have that minimum effective dose. So again, the question is, based off of this past season, how many of you average 3 dry land sessions a week? And like I said, I could, I'm not pointing any fingers or anything like that, but I could run data that says not many of you. My next question is, did you PR at some point this season? And if we looked at that question, a lot of you did, right? Or a majority of you did, or almost everyone, I think, had a PR at some point in the season. So again, I go back to that first point. There's no perfect program. And doing about 80% gets the job done. So this season, I want you to think about, how do I get to 85%? How do I get to 90% of completing what is scheduled? Because I didn't really do all of that much this year compared to what the research says, and I still had some success, right? So imagine if I actually hit some of those threshold numbers a little bit more consistently, what type of success could I have then? And that's a fun question to ponder, and that's when it gets really exciting from there. So as you can see, even though this is great information, based off of what we saw from this team this year, 3 sessions, we only met for 2 a week. I know that, but you had options to do up to 5. And I would say most of you did not do 3 a week and still had success. So think about, how can you be that 1% better when you're looking at your dry land? And that's how you should approach it. Where can I add just 1% here, 1% there, until I find that point where I don't need to really add anymore. And then I just have to focus on the quality of everything I'm doing. So that's kind of the gist for today. Like I said, I'm going to turn on the live video here now. And then let's